If you recall from last week, Jesus had been taken to Herod, and now he is being sent back to Pilate. This is during Jesus' trials before he is crucified. And we're going to start reading in verse 13. Luke 23, verse 13. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod. For I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." For it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. And they all cried out at once, saying, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder." Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Then he said to them the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go." But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. All four of the Gospels give us a lot of information about this final section of Jesus' trials. So we're going to be moving a lot. We're going to look at Matthew, we're going to look at John, and we're going to put everything together to get a fuller understanding of what happened, because this leaves a lot of questions open just if you read Luke on its own. What's the context? Jesus has been arrested, taken to Annas, then to Caiaphas, then to the entire Sanhedrin. This all happened during the night and at the break of dawn. They condemn him as a blasphemer because he has said that he is the Son of God. They take him to Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor. They don't say to Pilate, "We want to kill him because he's the Son of God," because he wouldn't care with a religious accusation like that. So they make it political. They say he tells us not to pay taxes, he's a threat to Rome, and so forth. Pilate examines him, finds nothing wrong, comes out and says, "I find no guilt in this man." But here's where he made his first mistake. What he should have done is said, "I find no fault in the man, therefore I release him." But he didn't do that. The Jews started complaining, started insisting, "No, you have to have him killed." And Pilate, instead of saying, "No, I've made my decision," backs up a bit and says, "Well, let's think about it again." And right there is where the Jews got him. They're like, okay, he is backing down. And so if we just push and push and push, we'll get him to do what we want him to do. And that's indeed what happened. Pilate tries to get out of it, sends Jesus to Herod. Herod examines him, doesn't find anything wrong with Jesus, sends him back to Pilate. And this is where we are in our text today. So, verse 13, it says, "Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people," notice for the first time here it says, "and the people." So far we had the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, and the rulers who had brought Jesus. Now people are mentioned, so crowds are starting to gather. Verse 14, "So he said to them, 'You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him.'" We had seen that. Pilate had examined him. And he says, "Look, you know that I examined him. You brought me no evidence. You brought me no proof. You brought me no witnesses. I interrogated him, and he has done nothing wrong." And what I want you to notice as we go through this, how often Pilate is going to say, I find no fault in this man. I want you to notice how often, again and again, he says, Jesus has done nothing wrong. And yet at the end, he sends him to be crucified. There's a problem there. So, verse 15, he says, no, neither did Herod. We're talking about finding a fault in Jesus. No, neither did Herod. For I sent you back to him, and indeed, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. Herod examined him. Herod laughed at him. Herod thought he was a joke, but he didn't think he was a criminal. And that's why he sent him back to me. He was like, you take it, you deal with this. He didn't even want to deal with it because he didn't find anything. So again, notice how often he keeps saying, I find no guilt in this man. Verse 16, I will therefore chastise him and release him. Wait a minute. If you say, I've examined him and I find no fault in him, you would think that the next sentence would be, I will therefore release him, right? But he says, I will therefore chastise him and release him. What's this? He hasn't done anything. You've just said that the man is innocent. Just as it would be unjust of you to have him killed, since he's innocent, it's also unjust to have him punished and beaten and chastised. He hasn't done anything. This is not justice. Why is he doing this? Why would he say, I'm going to have him chastised, I'm going to have him whipped, I'm going to have him beaten up, and then I'm going to let him go? What's that about? What he's doing is, he's trying to find a middle ground. He's trying to compromise with the Jews. He's trying to satisfy them. You see, he doesn't want to have Jesus killed. They want to have Jesus killed. So he's like, let's meet somewhere in the middle. And maybe we can both be satisfied. How about I beat him up? And that'll be his punishment. And then I'll let him go. Now again, this is not justice because he hasn't done anything wrong. So there is no reason to actually beat him up. He's thinking, well, in the long run it will be good because I can let him go and he's an innocent man. And most people think this way. They think, well, the end justifies the means. As long as we can get Jesus to go free, it doesn't matter if we do something unjust along the way. It's not what the Bible says. The Bible says, never do evil that good may come. Because he was planning on doing evil so that he could let Jesus go free. So that's his first plan. We see no reaction by the crowd right here. He just kind of throws that out, that, okay, I'll have him chastised and then I'll let him go. But there's an alternative plan. There's an alternative plan and it's better. Look at verse 17. It says, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. He doesn't give us a lot of explanation for that, so please turn to Matthew chapter 27 and verse 15. It says, now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. All right, the Jews have been conquered by Rome. All right, and so they hate Rome. And so every now and then, the Roman governor would throw them a bone, do them a favor, and release a prisoner. And they would do this at a feast, and they'd bring out a list of people. Who do you want me to release? This guy, okay, and the governor would pardon him. And so verse 16, it says, and at that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. He's a notorious prisoner. He is a well-known prisoner. John calls him a robber, the Gospel of John. Luke, which we read, says that he was in an insurrection and he was a murderer. Mark, this is interesting, Mark tells us that he was in prison, not by himself, but with his fellow robbers who altogether had been arrested for insurrection and murder. And so we know that when Jesus was, think about this for a moment, let me make a side note. When Jesus was crucified, he was crucified alongside of two robbers. And so it is very possible, extremely possible, that the two robbers that were crucified with Jesus were the fellow robbers of Barabbas. And the cross on which Jesus died was probably the cross where Barabbas was supposed to be executed, but instead Jesus died instead of him, and Barabbas went free, which is an interesting illustration of the gospel. I'm not saying that Barabbas was a believer or repented or anything like that, but it's an interesting picture of a man who was guilty, deserved to die, was going to die, and then he goes free and Jesus died in his place. Kind of reminds us of the gospel, because we are guilty sinners who deserve to be punished, but Christ dies in our place and we get to go free, just like Barabbas. So verse 17, it says, "Therefore, when they had gathered together, Pilate said to them, 'Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus who is called Christ?'" So Pilate, notice what Pilate does. He doesn't just pick a random prisoner. He picks a prisoner who is actually guilty of the same thing that they had accused Jesus of. They've accused that Jesus is the insurrectionist, that Jesus is the guy who's the threat to Rome. And so we're going to see their hypocrisy now in that he brings a guy who we know is guilty of these things, and yet they choose him to be released instead of Jesus, who hasn't done anything. So verse 18 says, "For he knew," speaking of Pilate, he knew that they had handed him over because of envy. He knew that Jesus hadn't done anything wrong and something was up. Now, verse 19 says, "While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, 'Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him.'" Hold on here. Pilate has said, "We have two men and I want to release one of them. Do you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus?" But before they answer, he gets pulled away. And someone comes and says, "I've got a message from your wife." And his wife says, "I've been up all night, troubled, having nightmares or whatever, about Jesus. So I don't have anything to do with him." The sad thing is, that's all we have. That one verse. We have nothing else in the entire Bible about this. So I don't know what was going on there. Either it was a vision from God, or it was simply this woman had heard of Jesus and she was having nightmares about him. I don't know, but whatever it is, she calls Jesus a just man, and she goes to Pilate and she says to him, "Don't have anything to do with him." And it just leaves it at that. So while Pilate was away getting this message from his wife, verse 20 says, "But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitudes that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." What was Pilate's plan originally? His plan was, look, if I bring Jesus and Barabbas, who are the people going to call for? I mean, for crying out loud, Barabbas is a murderer. This is a person you don't even want walking on the streets. And Jesus, I mean, he hasn't done anything wrong. In fact, just a few days earlier, people were yelling, "Hosanna to the Son of David." So surely, this is a way of getting Jesus released. I'm going to have the people choose Jesus, and he will go free, and there we go. But the plan backfires. I mean, for 3 years, people have been following Jesus, but most of them never really believed in him. You know, the Pharisees were always there to turn the people against Jesus and say, "Oh, you know, he's doing what he's doing by the power of Beelzebub," and stuff like that. So here, the chief priests, again, the leaders, go to the people while Pilate is away, and they are convincing them to yell to release Barabbas. So Pilate comes back out, verse 21. The governor answered and said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" They said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" They all said to him, "Let him be crucified." Then the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" Look, when the governor is pleading with the people, this is not good. He's supposed to be the guy in charge. And now he's like, why? This is a big problem. So verse 23, so the governor said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they cried out all the more, saying, "Let him be crucified." This is the people. Let him be crucified. You know, in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 3, when Peter, this is after the resurrection, after Jesus ascended to heaven, after the day of Pentecost, Peter is preaching to the Jews, and he doesn't ignore the fact that the Jews had Jesus killed and chose Barabbas instead of him. And he points it out. Let me read it to you. You don't have to go there. While he's preaching to the Jews, he says, this is Peter speaking, he says, "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, glorified his servant Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate when he was determined to let him go." He says, you're the ones that wanted this. You're the ones who had Jesus killed. Pilate was going to let him go, and you twisted his arm, and you forced him to do this. But you denied the Holy One and the Just, and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, and you killed the Prince of Life. Don't make any mistake about this. Pilate wanted to release him. You're going to see this throughout the lesson today. Pilate wants to let Jesus go, but the Jews insist that he be killed. Verse 24. When Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult, I don't know how you pronounce that, was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person. You see to it." Now, this doesn't actually mean that he was innocent. All right? I mean, he wasn't. He was doing something that was unjust. He was compromising. He was not doing his job. But he is pointing out that you are the ones that want this. I don't want this. You're the ones who are going to be guilty. And one of the most chilling statements in all the Bible is verse 25. "And all the people answered and said, 'His blood be on us and on our children.'" But let me make a quick side note here. A lot of people have taken that verse to accuse Jews of all time and say stuff like, "Oh, the Jews are cursed because they asked for Jesus' blood to be on them and their children." That's not what it means. If a Jewish person repents of his sins and trusts in Christ, he will be saved just as anyone else. There is no difference between Jew or Greek. All right? Now, back to Luke. Back to Luke 23. Verse 18. "And they all cried out at once, saying, 'Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison for a certain rebellion made in the city and for murder.' Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them, but they shouted, saying, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' Then he said to them the third time, 'Why, what evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him.'" This is the third time he is saying, "I find nothing wrong with Jesus." Third time. And he says, "I will therefore chastise him and let him go." So we're reverting to plan A. Plan A was, I'll chastise him and let him go. Plan B was that maybe they'll pick Jesus instead of Barabbas. That didn't work. So he's going back to plan A of having Jesus beaten up, whipped, and then letting him go. But is that enough for the people? No. Verse 23. "But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priest prevailed." They're like, chastising him is not enough. We want him dead. And with the worst kind of death, crucifixion. Now, verse 24, it says, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And you're like, whoa, that was pretty easy. They just insist, and he says, okay. We're going to go to John, because there's a lot of stuff that happened between verse 23 and 24. And so we need to look at that. Go to John chapter 19. And we're going to start in verse 1. It says, so then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. So he is going through with his plan. Even though he said, I'm going to have him beat him up and then let him go, and they said, no, crucify him, he is going to try it anyway. He's going to try his plan of having Jesus beaten and whipped to see maybe the people will be satisfied. The Greek word here is mastigoma, whipped. He has Jesus whipped. I don't know how much I should get into this right now. Let me be quick. The Romans had different levels of whipping depending on how seriously they wanted to punish you. Matthew and Mark don't say mastigoma, they say flagelloma. Flagelloma is not simply whipping, it's more than that. It's when you have a leather whip with strands, and at the end of the strands you have pieces of metal, bone, glass, anything. And when you whip, it doesn't simply cut the skin, it shreds. And that is what they did to Jesus. Oftentimes, prisoners would die from the whipping. In fact, what they usually did was they did this kind of scourging to people who had already been condemned to death, and so they'd be like half dead already, and they'd die much quicker when you executed them. But Jesus has not been sentenced yet. Jesus has not been sentenced yet. Pilate is having him scourged, and is going to try and bring him out and see what the crowd is going to say. Verse 2 and 3, verse 2 says, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put it on him a purple robe. Then they said, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him with their hands. Let me say something real quick. Has anyone seen The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson? Some people are nodding. I've seen it. A lot of people were upset with the movie because it's very violent. And it is extremely violent. But that's one of the few things in the movie that are actually true. You see images and movies where Jesus is like hanging on the cross, bit of blood here, bit of blood coming down the side. That's not how it was. Jesus was beaten half to death before he was even crucified. Okay? Isaiah 52 says that his appearance was marred, disfigured more than any man. By the time they were done with Jesus, you could barely recognize him. Realize that Jesus went through all of that before the crucifixion. And he went through all that for our sakes. So verse 4. Pilate then went out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no fault in him. You had no problem beating him up, but I find no fault in him. This is the fourth time he's saying that. Verse 5. Then Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. Jesus is standing there. He is beaten, bruised, covered in blood, can barely stand. He's dressed as a king, a mock king. And Pilate says, Look at him. Look at him. And I think his point is, come on. Come on. Does this not satisfy you? Look what I've reduced him to. Does this not satisfy your bloodlust? But it does not. Verse 6. Therefore, when the chief priests and officers saw him They cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Fifth time he says that. Now, he says, "You take him and crucify him." They can't take him and crucify him. Only the Romans can crucify him, but he's just annoyed. He's just frustrated. He's just sick and tired of them. So he just says, "You take him." Verse 7. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." Whoa, wait a minute. Whoa, wait a minute. Wait a minute. When they came the first time, they said he told us not to pay taxes, and he told us that there should be, he's an insurrectionist and stuff like that. Now, for the first time, they throw out that he says he's the Son of God. So you're Pilate. You're not necessarily an atheist. You believe in the Roman gods. You're Pilate. You have before you a prisoner who is different from any prisoner you've ever had before. He's calm and composed when people are swearing at him and yelling at him. He's a man who just told you a little while ago that he has a kingdom, and his kingdom is not of this world. Your wife comes and says, "Don't have anything to do with this man because I've had a dream about him." And now someone yells out, "He said that he's the Son of God." I don't know exactly what's going on in Pilate's mind right now, but verse 8 says, "Therefore when Pilate heard this saying, he was more afraid." He's like, what is going on? Who is this man? So he gets Jesus and they rush back in. Verse 9. And he went again into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" That's an interesting question. Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" Verse 11, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Behold, the sovereignty of God." Jesus has been beaten half to death. He can barely stand. Pilate says, "You're not going to talk to me? Don't you realize I have power to set you free or to crucify you?" And Jesus, who hasn't said anything up until this point, says, "I think I'm going to address this." And he says, he doesn't say you don't have authority. He says, "Yeah, I know you have authority, but the only reason you have authority is because it has been given to you from above, from God. You would have no authority unless God had put you in this place." And we need to remember that, please. All the people who are like, "Oh, I'm so great, and I'm so wise, and I'm so clever, and I'm the greatest person in the world," realize we are but clay in the hands of the potter who is sovereign over everything. Pilate was only in that position because God allowed him to be there. And Jesus says, "Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greatest sin." He's not saying, "Well, Pilate, you're not guilty." He's not saying you're not sinning. He is. But the ones who delivered me to you have the greatest sin, implying that you also sin, but it's a lesser sin. The one who delivered me, whether that's Caiaphas or he's talking about the Jews in general, I don't know, but they're more guilty than Pilate. Verse 12, it says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him." He's like, from that moment, he's like, "Okay, I'm done. I'm letting Jesus go. I don't like how this is going." But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." Now it's all coming to a close. In Luke, we read that they yelled and he said, "Okay, take him to be killed." This is why. This is the reason. They come to him and say, "Pilate, if you don't have Jesus crucified, we're going to go to Rome. And we're going to tell Caesar that you had a guy who claimed to be a king and you did nothing. That's treason. And so not only would Jesus be a traitor to the crown, to Caesar, but you let him go, which means that at best you'd lose your job, at worst you'd be killed also. Verse 13. When Pilate therefore heard of this saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew Gabbatha. Now it was the preparation of the Passover and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." But they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Notice John points out in verse 15 that it's the chief priests who say this. He doesn't say the crowd said this. The chief priests say, "We have no king but Caesar." And the sad thing about that is that's true. That's true. If God was their king, they wouldn't have killed Jesus. They didn't have any other king except Caesar. It's verse 16, Then he delivered him to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and led him away. Please turn back to Luke so we can finish our text. Luke 23. In verse 24, so Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus to their will. It's not that he delivered Jesus to the Jews, he delivered them to the soldiers to be killed, but he gives them over to their will. He does what they want him to do. Next week we will see Jesus along the road going to be crucified. But let me close with this small application. Every time I think of Pilate, there's the same thought that comes to my mind. Pilate tried a lot of things to get Jesus released. Pilate put a lot of effort. He came up with all kinds of plans in trying to get Jesus released. He tried to do what was right. He knew that Jesus was innocent. He tried to do what was right. He tried to do what was just until it became too risky for him. Until it would cost him personally. He was willing to do what was right until they threatened him. You're going to lose your job. You're going to lose your life. And that's when he backs up and says, okay, take him to be killed. He was willing to do what was right until it became personal. And so the question for us, the thought to keep in mind is, what do we do? When we're faced with a decision, and we know that if we do what's right, we're going to have trouble. If I do what's right, what if I lose my family? What if I lose my friends? What if I lose money? What if I lose my job? What if I lose my life if I do what's right? Do we go ahead and do what's right? Or we do what Pilate did and just say, okay, well, I don't care about the truth and justice that much. For Pilate, it was basically down to me or Jesus. If I let Jesus go, I may get killed. And I'm not willing to go that far. Take him, kill him. Are we going to do what's right, no matter what? Or are we going to be like Pilate? Jesus did what was right. Jesus had a decision to make, and he chose to do the right thing, and it cost him his life. And he died for us.